When I was growing up, I would say Palm Sunday may have been my favorite Sunday of the year. Now, of course, I liked Christmas, but that was more for the presents, of course. And I liked Easter, but that, of course, was about baskets and Easter egg hunts and so on and so forth. But on Palm Sunday, you got these palms, and it just seemed really cool to do that. As a child, I probably really didn't understand too much what that was about, or what you were supposed to do with them, but they were just fun to have, and of course you waved them a little bit. And then maybe the best part was that after the service, then you could have sword fights with your Sunday school classmates, because we got those long strips, and then do jokes. Well, then over the years, things changed. And by the time I got to seminary, Passion Sunday had arrived. And it was very shortly after that that the Green Book, the LBW, was published, and that became the official liturgy of the church. And as you are probably aware, this is where you start out the service with this palm entrance, like we just did. But then quickly the service changes in its tone, and the focus becomes the Passion. And if you go the whole route, then you do a long reading of the entire Passion. And usually you do it in parts where different people in the congregation play different roles, and that's happening at the 10 o'clock service today. Well, when I was in my first congregation, I was an associate and all fired up about these things, as young people always are when they learn something new, and said to my senior pastor, "We've got to do this." And my senior pastor was a little old school, shall we say, and was accustomed to a 20-minute sermon. And realizing that if we're having this full Passion reading, there ain't no way we're having a 20-minute sermon. So he was begrudgingly agreed to do this and cut back his sermon time. And I set up the parts, and we did it in 2 services with hundreds of people. It was all really great. And as the years went on, I continued to do that. But somehow the enthusiasm on my part started to wane, and questions started to be raised. And that kind of came to a head in a congregation where I was actually serving as the interim. And I was having a conversation with our lay parish assistant, Margine, who was just a wonderful person, smart, articulate, just do anything you ask her to do. And she said to me, "Well, I won't be there on Good Friday." And Margine was at everything. I mean, that's just who she was. And I thought, "Margine, why not?" And she looked at me and said, "It's just too sad." And Margine could probably tell you the theology of the cross better than most pastors could. I mean, she got it. And I was just kind of dumbstruck. But it really set the wheels turning in my head. And as time went on, I started to ask myself, what's really going on here? Not just what's going on liturgically in the church when we now have this kind of schizophrenic Palm Passion Sunday, but also what's going on in the Gospels as they tell us this story. And one of the reasons we ask that question today is because we look at the Gospels and the Bible generally in a little different way. We can't ignore now what probably 2 centuries of biblical scholarship has told us, which is that the Gospels are not just straightforward history, that each of the Gospel writers have a purpose, or as I sometimes say, each of them has an axe to grind. They've got something very specific that they're trying to tell us, and so they're very willing to make the story work so that it tells us that. Very simple example from this time. Mark is the earliest gospel, and he is the one that puts the Palm Sunday processional at the beginning of Holy Week. And Matthew and Luke, as they almost always do, follow his chronology, and they do the same. And for those 3 Gospels, it's pretty clear that this event is the beginning of what's going to get Jesus into trouble. In particular, it's the event that follows immediately after the processional, and that's the table-turning event in the temple. That's where people really get angry and say, we've got to do something about this guy. John, the last Gospel written, however, does something different. He doesn't want that event to be the precipitating event that leads to Jesus' death. And so he puts the table-turning event in the temple at the beginning of his gospel, or near the beginning of his gospel. For him, it's a different story. And we know what it is that gets Jesus into trouble. It was last Sunday's gospel. It's the raising of Lazarus. That's when all the Jewish heads start saying, we've got to do something with this man. So they're willing to play around with these stories. They don't think they're telling history in our modern sense. So when we look at these stories, we have to ask, what are they up to? What is it that's important to them in their telling of these stories? And are these same things still important to us 1900 years or more later after they were told? And as I looked at them, I began to have some troubles. Because I thought there were two things in particular that make these stories problematic. The first one, which has been discussed and worked over and hands wrung over, is simply the anti-Judaism of it all. There is, to some extent, that found throughout the Gospels, but here it really comes to a head. Because one of the primary themes of the story is Jesus' rejection by his people. It's what the whole trial is going to be about. And of course, it culminates where? But when the crowds gathered in front of Pilate, who's trying to be merciful, if you can buy that, they say, crucify him! Crucify him! Forget this mercy business. String him up. Get rid of him. That's a problem. And it's certainly become a problem in recent years. And for instance, the Passion Play in Oberammergau in Germany has struggled with this, trying to somehow retranslate things, rework the story a little bit to try to diminish that. But you can't. You can only diminish it so far because it's inherent in the story. That somehow the Jews are the ones who decided to get rid of Jesus. And in the Gospel of John, we get it's so ridiculous that the people who are opposing Jesus at multiple points in the story are simply referred to as the Jews. But Jesus was a Jew. The disciples were a Jew. In fact, almost everybody in these stories are Jews. But at this point in the story of the church, when these Gospels are written, is the time when Jews and Christians have parted company. Synagogue and church are going separate ways. And this is still early in the divorce, if you will, between these two groups, and it's still pretty nasty. And that comes through in these stories. Is that really what we want to be hearing? Well, in addition, of course, to Jesus being killed because of his rejection by his people, we have just the whole interpretation of his death. Why did Jesus die? That question kind of hangs over the Gospels. Because part of the theme of the Gospels is that this is in the cards right from the start. Jesus came to die. And not just die of old age, but in this dramatic sacrificial sense. He is the ultimate sacrifice. Like the animals being slaughtered in the temple, Jesus now is slaughtered. For what? For the sins of the world. Jesus pays the price. Jesus propitiates God's anger and wrath. Oh my. Again, is that the picture that we want? One of the things that modern scholarship has done again is to give us a clearer picture, at least a different picture of Jesus, whose interest is not so much in some grand event coming way down the road in the eschaton, but in life here and now. Life here in this place, our lives, and especially in our relationships with each other. So he comes again and again, forgiving the unforgivable, welcoming the unwelcomable, breaking down barriers, talking about the kingdom, a place where the poor and the unloved are given equal status. I think it's often true that our understanding of these stories sometimes is based on a mental picture we have. Sometimes reinforced by preaching, sometimes now by movie versions we've seen of it. I have a different picture, I think, of the Palm processional than perhaps we have, which is this solemn event, But if you look at the Zechariah story, which obviously inspires it, there's a lot of humor here. Behold, your king is coming. Well, a king was always a warrior, a great soldier. He'd be riding in on a mighty war horse with a staff and sword and all of that. Behold, your king is coming, and he's riding in on a donkey. And here I have to say I prefer the King James Version, which is, he's riding in on an ass. Oh yes, your mighty king has come. But he's come to break the sword, to throw away the shields, to bring peace. And so Jesus comes riding in, and I love it in Matthew. He takes the Zechariah story literally when it says there's a donkey and a foal. And so somehow Jesus is depicted riding both of them. I'm not quite sure how that looks. But anyway, then he comes in and we wave the palms, and it's almost like carnival, like Mardi Gras. Jesus is coming into Jerusalem as the king, and he's the strangest king you've ever seen. The story that immediately follows this one, the very next verse, Jesus goes into the temple and tosses over the tables. And for me, I continue that image. We usually see Jesus as angry with a whip and all this kind of stuff. Zeal for the house shall consume me, is the interpreted verse. But again, I think Jesus walks into this public space and laughs. This is God's house of prayer. And he sees all these people busily making change. And he comes in and starts knocking the tables over. And the coins are bouncing across the floor, and he sees the men chasing after them. My God, my money is escaping. This is the house of prayer. It looks like a den of robbers to me, he says. John Dominic Crossan, a contemporary New Testament scholar, gives a serious interpretation of this event, however, because all that money changing had a purpose. It was the way in which the sacrificial system worked. People discovered, it was all a racket, of course, that if they brought their own dove or goat to be sacrificed, the priest always found some blemish with it. It wasn't really perfect enough. Oh, but we've got one right here we'll sell you that'll work. And so all this money changing was so that people could buy these animals to be sacrificed. And you couldn't use the Gentile Roman currency, you had to have the temple currency. So when Jesus comes in and knocks these tables over, he effectively stops the sacrificial system. What really had been the purpose of the temple in the eyes of the priestly authorities at the time. In Crossan's words, he says, Jesus destroys the temple, symbolically. He's not interested in this kind of a religion where you have to go through the motions and meet these rituals and rules in order for you to be able to reach God. God's God is right here in our midst. God is in our love for each other. God is when we gather and break bread together. This is all serious to me because I think about Margie. And I remember her as being this dedicated, loyal, committed person, and yet she is repulsed by the story. This story keeps her away. And I wonder, in our day of declining churches, how many of our traditional symbols and stories are also keeping people away. This is the classic issue for the Reformation, right? For Luther. The church is doing things that is blocking them from hearing the gospel. They're putting up obstacles to people seeing Jesus. Is it possible that these stories, as old as they are doing the same? Because we now know that this isn't necessarily the only way to understand the events of that time, to understand this person. There's someone else in the midst of all of this, a loving and caring and passionate person with a radical view of how human beings can live together. And I think our goal has to be to help people to see that Jesus. To do whatever we need to do to take down those barriers, clear away the fog, so that people see that loving Jesus. And see him in such a way that, like those crowds in our Palm Sunday story at the end, say, who is this? And we say, with a twinkle in the eye perhaps, this is the prophet Jesus of Nazareth in Galilee. Amen.
Amen.